All right, so there's really three topics I wanted to cover today. And talk about weed control and dry bean. The unfortunate thing is we really don't have new herbicides to work with. So it's been the case for several years now. So I'm going to focus on just these three things on the screen here. Some of the research that Greg Indris has done at Carrington for cover crops, and then focusing on some tough ragweed and water hemp situations that I expect to expand into the future. So first of all, while we're talking about cover crops for weed control, there's obviously a number of different reasons why we would look at cover crops in general. And our dry bean survey that goes out every year, this is the 2018 survey, just the number of reasons why people are using cover crops. If I look at North Dakota, we had one respondent in 2018 saying it was weed control was the reason for using cover crops. The 2019 version of the survey, we actually bumped up to 10. So, an additional 9 people answered in 2019 looking at cover crops for weed control and dry bean. So this is certainly an area of interest and something we need to further explore. If nothing else, like I mentioned, we don't have any new herbicides coming, so an additional tool that can help us with weed control and dry beans. So these next couple slides will look familiar if you were sitting in on Greg Indris's talk. He allowed me to use these slides. Really, though, I'm just going to focus on the weed suppression aspect of his research. So an additional slide that he did not share with everyone earlier. And that will be this slide here. So that research that Greg talked about earlier with cover crops, one of the things also looked at was weed control. In this case, these are ratings for grass weed control, primarily foxtail or pigeon grass, and generalized over 4 different types of programs. The black bar on the left is our conventional check, which was no cover crop with the pre-emergence herbicide. In this case, it was Spartan Elite or Spartan Charge, given depending on the year. Just terminating that cereal rye about 32 days prior to planting with just glyphosate. Here in the light blue bar, we've got glyphosate with a pre-herbicide, that same 32-day termination timing. And on the right is waiting until a couple of days before planting to terminate rye with just glyphosate. So as you can see, if we really want to look at the conventional check, just a herbicide, versus the right side, where we just had the cover crop terminated with just glyphosate, we did have at least a slight numerical increase. There are no stats on the screen for weed control at ratings were taken at the post-emergence timing in this case. So no residual herbicide, similar, if not maybe a little bit better, weed control on our foxtails, just using that rye cover crop. However, as Greg mentioned earlier, there can be an issue with this. So this research was conducted over those dry years. And so in this case, we had that similar weed control, but because of the moisture competition with cereal rye, we did see that decreased yield of our pinto beans compared to our conventional check. So something we need to explore further. Certainly shows promise, and I think certainly shows some promise if we have a wetter spring where moisture is not the limiting factor. Maybe we'll get one of these this year for our cover crop research. But certainly an additional tool to evaluate moving forward, shows some promise, at least for early season weed competition compared to our more conventional checks. And so this slide just kind of summarizes some of Greg's notes, repeating some of the things that I had just mentioned. Certainly can be a supplement to our soil applied herbicides. Really, I'd like to see some programs where we have that termination close to planting plus a residual herbicide, but it all also comes back to it's not going to be a season-long weed control program. We'll still have to have post-emergent applications, and we also need to do some work to tease out differences between species. Some species could tolerate that shading effect and competition from rye better than other species. One species, weed species, that I think we have promise for this cover crop concept would be common ragweed. So a couple updates on common ragweed. This is a field on the Minnesota side that I walked this past summer. This field actually had a couple of weeds in here. You see some water hemp, but in the back part of the screen, you see the yellow. That's maturing dry bean. This is late summer, and all that green is just common ragweed. So we had about 50 acres of common ragweed overtaking this dry bean crop. What's important to note here, and what I want to talk about for ragweed control, as I kind of foresee this becoming tougher in the future as we don't get additional dry bean herbicides. The 4-year rotation on this particular field was either dry bean or soybean, and the herbicide rotation was Spartan followed by Reflex. So kind of a worst case scenario about relying on one mode of action herbicide. We're trying to test these ragweed plants to confirm resistance. It's probably a formality at this point, but certainly you can see we can develop some sort of issues here. So if we assume it's group 14 resistant, and we know we have some group 2 or permit resistant out there as well, permit raptor resistance, that really limits us on what we can use in dry beans for ragweed control if we have a situation like this. And so that's where I like to turn back to our survey and really talk about using crop rotation for problem weeds, especially ragweed. If we have this field in particular, but also as ragweed resistance continues to expand in the upcoming years, really relying on our crop rotation ahead of dry beans. So I'm going to focus on the North Dakota side. So the 2019 survey, luckily about 102% of you used either wheat or corn before dry beans, and the other 30% of people had some other crop before dry beans. Clearly that's more than 100%, but that's just the multiple operations showing what they planted before dry beans. The important part this year on the survey, it's ranked by the 4-year average. And so, North Dakota going with wheat or corn before dry beans from a weed control perspective is a very good thing. We can use different tools to drive down our weed populations. Even soybeans, if we go soybean ahead of dry bean, if we use a traded soybean, such as Enlist, Extend, or even Roundup Ready, we have an additional tool that we don't have in our dry beans to really try and help drive down some of these weed populations. The last thing I'm going to switch gears and talk about for the last 10 minutes or so here is just water hemp issues. I have the title in 2019, but really moving forward. And when I talk about water hemp issues and water hemp weed control, when I get to the chemical part, I also want to talk about that what we're using to control water hemp will also control things like Powell amaranth. We do have increasing reports of ALS, which is our group 2 herbicides, such as Permit and Raptor. We have increased reports of ALS herbicides not working quite as well on Powell amaranth, especially in that Devil's Lake area. So chemically, we'll talk about that. Keep that in mind as I talk about water hemp, but water hemp's really the one thing I want to focus on. Here's just our current map in North Dakota of counties where we know water hemp exists. A major problem in the southeast corner of the state, but we can find pockets across the state, and certainly there are some heavy pockets in some of our dry bean areas. Another reason to focus on water hemp is really looking at our survey again. So here's the 2018 survey. Those of you calling in from Minnesota are certainly aware of water hemp. About 25% of the acres, it was reported as the worst weed problem in dry bean 2018. Water hemp in North Dakota was about 3% of the acres. Compare that to the most recent survey, holding about steady as the most problematic weed in Minnesota. But North Dakota, we are seeing increased reports of water hemp, and especially on our dry bean acres. So I don't foresee this problem going away anytime soon. This is quite the problematic weed. So that's why I want to focus on that, especially as it ascertains or pertains to dry beans. Of course, one of the reasons with water hemp, herbicide resistance is really what drives this being a problematic weed. So when we look at the top 15 weeds in the world, as far as the sites of action of herbicide resistance, water hemp is the second worst broadleaf weed, only behind Palmer amaranth. So as far as broadleaf weeds that are problematic because of herbicide resistance, water hemp would be number 2 in the world, and we certainly have our share of resistance problems up here as well. Just a slide covering some of the things about water hemp biology. The one thing I really want to focus on is this long emergence period, because that can really become problematic for us in our dry bean production systems. We'll get germination throughout the summer, so other crops we have a lot more options as far as our what we call overlapping residuals. Not as many options in dry bean as we would like at this time. And so here's a slide I stole from Bob Hartzler, weed scientist at Iowa State. focusing on soybean, but the concept really does remain for dry beans as well, where if we look at the middle of the slide, a layered residual program is what we really need to focus on for season-long control of water hemp. And so in this case, the red triangle represents our residual herbicide that we apply at planting. At some point throughout the season, 4 to 6 weeks after planting, our residual herbicide is running out. Water hemp will emerge and come through that. We need an effective post-emergence option. And the way to really control water hemp season long is more residual and that post-emergence application to get to crop canopy, and the crop canopy can bring us to harvest. Comparing that to, traditionally we may not add in another residual herbicide, and this is why we can get some late season flushes of water hemp, is when we don't have more residual in the soil and water hemp can continue to germinate until we get crop canopy. So a couple of slides focusing on soybean, because I'm going to bring this and tie this back into crop rotation. And the reason I want to show this slide on soybean, here's really our options for water hemp control in soybean. Pre-emergence options on the top, a couple of different programs. The Authority or Spartan, Valor, and Residual products tend to give us the best control. Of course, out of these, we can only use the Spartan products in dry beans. And then also another couple of different options we can use in soybean. What I really want to focus in on is on the post-emergence options for what we're going to always assume is ALS-resistant water hemp. In soybean, you can see we've got our group 14 herbicides. Out of these, we can only use, we can't use Flexstar in dry bean, but Reflex. So otherwise, we can't use the traded herbicide resistance Liberty, Extended Max, or Enlist in dry bean, obviously, but that's just kind of what we're limited to even in soybean. Kind of to show how a program would work, there is, if we do nothing, this is kind of a mixed water hemp with some Palmer amaranth population. If we use a residual herbicide at planting and no residual herbicide in our post-emergence application, we'll still have some weeds escape towards the end of the year. And here's kind of a comprehensive program, what we can accomplish with weed control for water hemp in soybean. Now, if you kind of look at the front, it's a pretty comprehensive program that we could never use in our dry beans. So I really want to just continue to emphasize that point home. If we assume ALS-resistant water hemp, which we always will, in this case, the glyphosate resistance doesn't matter for dry beans, here's basically what we have available today to use. So pre-emergence, we still do have a couple good programs, and some of these can be tank mix. For instance, Spartan Elite. I know we still have the 24C label in North Dakota. I don't know the Minnesota situation at this time, but we have some pre-mixes. So we have some good things to use at planting, but post-emergence is where we're limited with dry beans. Now on this slide, I mentioned not PPO or group 14 resistance. At this time, we do not have any cases that we are aware of in North Dakota, but Minnesota is a slightly different story though. So this is just a map for the Midwest. For Minnesota, I want to focus in on these orange counties. Any county that is in orange, that is a county where we have confirmed PPO or group 14 resistant water hemp. Now, the other important thing to talk about with our group 14 resistant water hemp is that's resistance to our post-emergence herbicides. So in this case, Flexstar would not work post-emergence. What I want to focus in on, though, is I turned the color of Spartan into red. When we have group 14 resistance, it's resistance to post-emergence herbicides, but reduced sensitivity to our pre-emergence herbicides. So we can still get some residual control out of Spartan on this resistant population, but we'd expect about half the control. So if we typically get 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 2 to 3 weeks of residual control. And so that becomes almost untenable if we have a major water hemp field on our water hemp issue in our dry bean fields. That will make it very difficult for water hemp control in dry beans. That's where I just tie it back into crop rotation. As I mentioned earlier, also same thing holds for water hemp as holds for ragweed, that a lot more options in wheat and corn for control of these problematic weeds. Soybean, when we use that, well, we want to use one of the traded soybean varieties, so that we can get some post-emergence control of water hemp as well. So for water hemp, more so than ragweed, the real true reason to use our crop rotation, and especially if we can take a 2-year break away from dry beans, we can drive down a water hemp population in a hurry. So this is just some research that was conducted several years ago across multiple states, showing how long does water hemp seed live in the soil. And there's also palmer amaranth data. But on the right side of the screen, we have water hemp. So basically, if we had a seed shed event in, call it October, and came back the next October, 12 months later, only 15% of that water hemp seed is viable. 2 years later, it's down to 5 to 10%. And if we waited 3 years, only 5% of that seed is still viable. So if we can use our crop rotation where we have other herbicides that are better for water hemp control than what we currently have in dry bean. So if we took a 2-year break out of a dry bean, used our other tools to drive down that water hemp population, we can make it to a much more controllable type situation where we really can't expect 100% weed control in dry bean with our current tools, but we can certainly get a dry bean crop off that field with minimal reduction in yield loss, I should say.